Origin stories, origin stories. Where did we come from? How did we get here? These are the stories that made us the heroes that we are today. Why don't we just start with your first book? Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, okay, so here's the origin. So for the 60s, most of the 60s, I read comics, my brother and I, but it was sort of the way kids do. We knew about comics, we read comics, they were around. We probably, over the course of the 60s, had a collection of about 100 comics, varied comics. And I read more because somebody in the neighborhood would have a comic. So it was like I was aware of comics, not so much like I wasn't aware of artists or even writers. I probably knew Stan Lee, but even back, but one of the things I picked Spider-Man 8, and the reason is it's because I remember reading that. But when I started, just to jump to the later, when I really started reading and collecting, which was 1970, I remembered that book. And when I got the reprint and later a copy of it, it was like, yeah, I remember reading this book when I was really young. Especially what I really remembered was the second, it's two stories. One, Spider-Man fighting the Spider Slayer robot, and then Spider-Man and the Human Torch having a little battle. And I remembered the picture, the first page where Johnny Storm is in a Corvette and Peter's kind of looking over. And I remember reading it and going, why does everybody know who Johnny Storm is? Because don't superheroes have secret identities? And my brother or one of my friends explained that the Fantastic Four don't have secret identities. So that's like the earliest book I definitely remember reading, and I was 6 or 7. Also, my brother and I both remember now. So I'm saying we had about 100 books, which of course our mother somewhere in the late 60s made us throw all of them out. And both my brother and I, we can't be sure, but we both kind of remember Amazing Fantasy 15 in that stack. So, which we later kept telling our mother how much she threw out there.
Yeah.
But we had early Spider-Man, and I think during the 60s, I probably read more Marvel than DC. I kind of we knew the characters. We were in the zeitgeist. You read those, you kind of knew them, but I wasn't following them. You just pick up, it was because Stan Lee, every issue. So I'd read a book, a couple years later, I'd read another. Batman and Superman around, I don't remember reading much of them. Probably read some Archie stuff. Mad Magazine, we definitely read a lot. We read the occasional Creepy or Eerie. So they were all kind of books you knew, and as a kid reader, you don't, I probably, if I read an issue of Batman that said signed by Bob Kane, I probably thought that's who did the book. But then, okay, so the next book, we can go to the next book, because that's why Spider-Man just indicates all those early books. We lived in Miami. We both, my brother surfed more than me, but we both surfed. We were, in the water a lot. And when we knew Silver Surfer, for some reason, we knew that book was coming out. And that book we collected. We bought all 18 issues of Silver Surfer. And that was the only books we kept when my mother made us throw them all out. So the Silver Surfer was like the first book I collected or co-collected with my brother. And it was because he was a surfer. And then when that book was really made for, young adults, people, I think people read it now and go, oh, geez, it's so full, it's so overwritten. It's this guy, it's so down. But the reason, it did resonate, and it still does, and people talk about is, hey, when you're 12 or 15, this character who's like an outsider and nobody understands and is just trying, it's really, Stan really grabbed something that he was aiming at a certain age group. I hate when people say, oh, it wasn't fun. It was always like, you know what? It really kind of hit home with a lot of young guys in a way, because you start realizing the world is, a terrible place and people aren't good, and it's in the whole superhero myth of doing something, but to the idea of being misunderstood is really strong. That's why Spider-Man was so popular. He was completely misunderstood. And Silver Surfer was done in the same vein, but he wasn't as much fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a couple thoughts. Like for me, hearing you talk about your memories of Spider-Man 8, I have a similar experience where I know now that Black Hawk 269 was my first comic, but for a long time I wasn't sure what it was because I had bought these couple of comics. I knew that they were issues of Black Hawk, and then I didn't have a chance to get to a store that had comics for several months after that. And then when I got back, then I really started buying comics. But I knew somewhere that I had read these issues of Black Hawk. And when I finally, many, many years later, collected the full run of the 80s Black Hawk series, when I was reading through it, I got to this specific scene that was in my memory. And like the one you're talking about with Johnny Storm, or for me, it was a scene where the Black Hawks have captured these German soldiers and they leave one of them to guard them. And when the others leave, the guy they leave as the guard shoots them on and murders all of them. And this was, I couldn't believe it. Like I couldn't believe it. And that scene was seared in my head, but I didn't know, I just couldn't remember anything about what issue number or anything like that. So when I read issue 269, 15 years later, and I saw that scene, I was like, that's it. That's the one from when I was a kid. That was the scene that I remembered.
Yeah.
My brother never got into comics. We used to argue about it because he was into baseball cards. And so he would be like, oh, your comics are stupid. They're all just like stories and, they're not real. And I was like, well, you can't do anything with a baseball card. You can read stories in comics. Baseball cards are just photos. There's nothing interactive about them. So we used to argue. So I kind of envy that experience that you had, having someone else there, to go to read the stuff with and collect with and stuff.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, so the main, and also I picked Silver Surfer 6 was absolutely my favorite issue because it was really a standalone science fiction issue where Silver Surfer goes to the future and fights this, I think it was the Overlord, I think his name was. This creature who, through some kind of radiation with his parents, which was a very novel idea at the time, becomes this all-powerful creature that takes over the galaxy. And the Silver Surfer fights him. And it was just a cool science fiction story. It was almost like a 50s, Marvel monster story. But with the Silver Surfer, it kind of stood alone, and it really, just kind of had a nice, outside the Marvel universe story. And, and I'm sure the art, which was fantastic, probably kept us going, even though we didn't know who John Buscema was. But speaking of which, so what happened around late 69 or so, my brother in high school got a new best friend, Mike, he was really into comics. He had been buying Marvel throughout the Silver Age. He had a whole collection. He had, pretty much all Marvels and a whole bunch of DCs. And he started teaching us. He started telling my brother and I about the Marvel comics and who the characters were and their history and key issues, and telling us about the different artists, discerning, how to tell the difference between, Gene Colan and John Buscema and John Romita and what Kirby meant and all that. And so I started reading his and reading comics more through him. You know, he'd loan us a few. And then for some reason, and I probably saw the ad, Conan is coming, that ad with him. I think Maurice Severin did the drawing of that little half-page ad of Conan. And I said, that looks cool. I'm going to buy that. I don't know why that was the comic I decided to buy, but I bought Conan 1 in 1970. And it just changed my world. It was that, you know, the Barry Smith art, which was, you know, crude for him compared to what he could do later, was just amazing. I don't know why that book just, I know that if you're familiar with Conan 1.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So the scene, all the stuff, the you know, Sword and Sorcery wasn't big yet. Sword and Sorcery were like, there were some bad movies with dragons. There wasn't, I hadn't read Conan yet. And it just, you know, was just a really cool story. The story where the part where he's in the cave and the mage or the wizard has these visions, and it sort of tells the story of mankind where it goes through coal and then the sinking of Atlantis and then the rise of man. And then he sees a man walking in space and it just destroys his mind. I just thought, this is the coolest thing. There's just this little comic and they're telling the story of mankind. And it just, I said, I'm going to keep reading this. So I started buying all the Conans. I missed 2. It took me, I didn't get number 2 because it was hard to find. I think I bought issue 2 like after I bought issue 4 because I found it somewhere in some store, fortunately. I mean, had to be lucky. There was no place. But I read Conan, and I probably still read a few books borrowed from Mike or something, but that was the book I was buying and keeping and collecting. And it just got better and better. I mean, the second issue I loved, and then, you know, by issue 4 you had Howard the Elephant, and, you know, they were adapting Robert E. Howard, which I later started, you know, not that long after, but I started reading. But it was just a phenomenal book, and Barry Smith was just killing it. I mean, you know, he's you know, as I said, he kept improving. As you know, you look at the art in issue 1 and the art in issue, say, 8 or 9, not even the art later when he came back, which was spectacular. And it was a great book. And it really got me like, I'm buying this book, I'm keeping this book. So that was like my origin of being a comic reader and collector, of really, you know, of not just, okay, I'll read some books. And I think our friend Mike, who we're still very close friends with, probably, you know, got me thinking about, you know, how good comics are, that they weren't this, you know, just something occasionally.
Yeah. So it's Conan for me. First of all, you're absolutely right. There's something magical about the Barry Smith issues. And there's nothing against, obviously, John Buscema did it for many years and a great run, particularly when Roy Thomas was still writing it. But there's something about those Barry Smith, those first 24 issues, that are just, they're just great. They're just special. Conan was one of the first comics that I read. My first issue, I'm not actually sure what it is. I think it was 166. I know I was reading by 168. And, you know, I've lamented on here before, talking to other people, that, like, obviously you go to the comic store now and there's like so much stuff, but the big two, you know, Marvel and DC, I think, really dropped the ball, but particularly Marvel, by focusing so much in later years on the superhero stuff and letting those other genres disappear.
Yeah.
Because they're a great gateway into comics. When I started reading, it was everything I was reading was science fiction. It was fantasy. It was all licensed properties. You know, I was reading Transformers, G.I. Joe, ROM, Micronauts, Conan, Star Wars. and those brought me into comics. And then I found the superhero stuff, and they sort of got rid of that. And it's just a real shame, because I think they missed out on a lot of people discovering comics, through those things. It's interesting when you're talking about your friend Mike. I feel like in my experience, that was me. I was the Mike for everybody else, because when I went to a little private Christian school, there were very few people that had comics there, because most of their parents wouldn't let them. But luckily, my dad had read comics when he was in the Marines, and so he was fine with me reading comics. So I was like recruiting all of my friends, telling them all. And I remember, walking, we'd have these walkathons to like raise money for the school or whatever we were doing, and just walking around the block and just explaining, the origin of Thor and the origin of the Fantastic Four to my friends. And then, then they get into comics because I've made it sound so cool. Yeah, it's, when you run into people that are passionate about comics, it's hard to, it's exciting.
Yeah. No, he, and actually Mike, so he was my brother's friend. He's 3 years older, but what happened, just, we stay friends, but they both we were in Florida, they both went to University of Florida, but my brother changed schools. But I also went to University of Florida, but when I got there, Mike was still there. So, that was, we were in the same fraternity, and we shared a lot, comics and things like that. So it was, and as I said, we're still friends. We still, talk about comics, and it really, it's, you need somebody to kind of open your eyes, because even if you've read comics, it's just, there's, I guess there's a depth of the genre that you don't get just casually reading, which I think today you can't casually read Marvel or DC, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Which is too bad. And so I'm reading Conan, and not buying anything else. I know, because I'd have to look at, when things came out compared to when other things. It's hard. I know I bought New Gods, which came out around a little later. There's probably 1 or 2 books I bought along the way, but I wasn't buying comics. And then, and Conan just kept on getting better. It's funny, Conan, when Barry Smith left, I was just devastated. And then Gil Kane came over too. And now, looking back, those Gil Kane issues are really beautiful. But at the time, I hated them. I just thought, no, this isn't Barry Smith. Nobody else can draw Conan. It has to be Barry. But there was a time when an artist leaving a book for another artist really, really impacted me. And which is, now you go, okay, so I don't like that artist. I'll go someplace else. But when you're so invested in a book with an artist attached, that it really does. Did you ever have that experience?
When I was young, I would read anything by anybody. And so like there was a point where I was reading like 39 titles a month. Anything, wow. I would read anything. And so it took me a while to realize, I like this artist, I like this writer. It was just, I was so into the form that I was just, even bad comics were still comics. The one I remember, and it took me a while on this one, but I really, really loved Alpha Flight. It was like one of my top 2 or 3 books. And they had this crazy thing they did with at the end of issue 28, where, John Byrne had been writing and drawing Alpha Flight. Yeah. They traded creative teams. He switched, they had a crossover with Hulk, and John Byrne went over and took over Hulk. And the creative team from Hulk, which was Bill Mantlo writing and Mike Mignola on art, came over and took over Alpha Flight. Okay. And so I followed John Byrne to Hulk, which I hadn't been reading, and I didn't last too long there because I just don't like the Hulk. That's when I discovered how much I don't like the Hulk.
Oh, okay.
But Alpha Flight went sideways so quickly. Like the ideas that Bill Mantlo brought in were just like whiplash. The art was completely different. You know, I didn't understand what they were doing with anything. And I kept reading it. But my love of the title like took a huge nosedive.
Yeah.
And that's the one I really remember realizing, oh, wait a minute, like these, you know, it really matters who's doing these books, because I thought that I loved the series and the characters, but what I loved was what this person was doing with those
Yeah.
things. And they just went completely nuts on that, on Alpha Flight. Some of the weirdest comics right after that switch.
Yeah, I mean, as far I know, when I started, well, getting ahead of myself, when I started buying like Batman, I would buy, if it was Neil Adams, I'd buy it. I bought the ones Marshall Rogers did. It wasn't a comic I'd collect, except I see who did it. Now, sometime along this time, when I'm reading all these Conans, about near sometime, let's see, that's like 70. Conan was bi-monthly, so somewhere around Conan 10 or 11, which is whatever, 15 months later. And I'm probably checking out all the other Marvels. I'm probably reading a few, but not buying them. I don't know what, this was my big decision, and I don't know why I did it this month. And I don't, to this day, I don't remember. There was a month where every Conan, every Marvel became 25 cents in a double issue. And I don't know if I thought, oh, these are important books. I don't know if I just said, enough, I want to read these. I bought almost every Marvel. Just one month I said, I'm buying all the Marvels. I don't know if I bought any before that. I might have bought a couple Spider-Man, but that's why it's Avengers 93 is when I started buying Marvel. And which is an amazing book to jump on to Avengers, because it's the first issue of the Kree-Skrull War by Neil Adams and Roy Thomas. I mean, if you're going to jump into Avengers, so all of a sudden I'm buying and reading every Marvel, and you know, and my initiation is early in John Buscema's FF. You know, Gene Colan's on Daredevil, Gil Kane's doing Spider-Man, Kree-Skrull War, and it was just, and I go, and I loved reading all of them. It wasn't like, am I going to enjoy this? I just started reading them, and you know, it just kind of changed everything. Because now instead of buying Conan every month, I'm buying like however many books, plus a few DCs. I'm buying Swamp Thing, Batman when it's, you know, when it's an artist I like. I'm trying to think whether that, the Shadow, you know, in that time, a few other DCs like the Shadow and things like that. But I became mainly a Marvel zombie. I'm reading, the only book I didn't consistently buy was Iron Man for some reason. I didn't at the time like George Tuska that much. So I'd buy occasional issues of Iron Man, but that was like the only Marvel superhero I didn't regularly buy. And it just, you know, okay, I'm buying and collecting comics now. And I told my mother, we are not throwing these out. Not this time.
Well, so, you know, a couple thoughts. I had that run of Iron Man. I don't remember why. About 15 years ago, I bought a lot on eBay, and it was like, I had like issues 39 to 50. So it was right when that was, and they're bad. They are bad. So that might be why you weren't buying it, because they got better as that went along, but there was like, there was some really bad stuff there. I wonder if the reason you started that month, I'm just going to spitball here, but that month is the month they did all the double size, the 25 cent double size issues, was the cover dated November 1971. It was the Marvel 10th anniversary month, because Fantastic Four 1 was November 1961. Right. So I don't know. I'm just wondering, because I remember as a kid, relatively early on in my collecting. I started, reading in '84, but I have, the month in November 1986 where they did the frame covers, where all the covers are portraits surrounded by the people.
Yeah.
Like that's something to this day where there's people that collect the entire Marvel line to get all the matching covers. I could definitely see that feeling like a great jumping on point, the 10th anniversary.
It could be. I'm sure there was something of, going on, because as I said, I wasn't oblivious to all the other comics. I wasn't reading them. Our friend Mike might have had an issue, but for some reason, and I've really thought about it. I don't know why that month I decided I'm buying these comics. It probably just came to a head. I was probably looking, when I'd buy my Conan, I'd look at the other books. I think they were pretty neat, and I just said, I should be doing this.
It's an expensive month to do that. Since
it was, it's crazy month to do it. Why, now they're going from 12 to 25. The next month they went back to 15. They actually, I've heard they've screwed DC in that, because DC went up to 25 and didn't know Marvel was just jumping back. And then you could buy a Marvel for 15, and DC stayed at 25 for a little while. And now we look at that. I just bought books last month that were $4.99, and it wasn't expensive. I don't know. Did I have more money in my pocket? I mean, we didn't have a lot of, I had an allowance, but it was November, which would have been 3 months before, so it would have been August. End of summer, did I have some extra money from a summer job? I just can't. I can't tell you, but that's what it is. And soon after that, so I'm reading now all these Marvels and really enjoying them. And one thing I could do, from the beginning, as I'm reading these, the art was, as much as I love the stories and the characters, the art it was just dominated for me. And I thought the art was amazing. I mean, those artists, like Romita, Buscema, Gene Colan, I mean, they're still my favorites. And Kirby in the Fourth World, so I'm not reading. So I'm reading these, and it's, back then Stan would go, you read about that in Avengers 48, or Avengers 58, when you read about that. And I'm going, there's these whole stories that I'm not aware of. I could ask Mike, who's, by this time, I think, or the next year, him and my brother were going to college, but there's no internet to look up. There's no, Marvel fan page, and I can find out who, nowadays somebody shows up on the Superman TV show, and I go, I have no idea who that is, and you look it up. Oh, okay. So I'm going, there's these stories that I want to read. Thor. You read about that. You read about the Odin sword. So I'm going, okay. So they had the ads for Rocket Blast and Passaic, which were the two main, not used, but out of print comic collectors. There was, there were these ads in the comic book saying, write us for our catalog to buy old comics. One was the one I usually used. I didn't use Rocket Blast. I used Passaic mostly, but you get their catalog, which would be this mimeographed catalog stapled together that had all the books and the prices and the condition. And I just was using my allowance or whatever, and I started buying old books and going backwards. And at the time, I don't think I would buy books for like 25 cents to $1 for these old books. I'd go back as far as I could, and I'd buy a run. I'd go, okay, look, I can get Fantastic Four back to issue whatever, 75 for 25 cents a piece, and that'll cost me $10 or whatever, and I can do that. So I started doing that and building this big Silver Age collection. And I I kept going back and back and back till they got too expensive, till they got to like $3. So I didn't spend the $20 for, say, Fantastic Four 1, which was what it cost at the time, I think. Or, you know, but my runs went pretty. Fantastic Four went back into the 20s, and I might have had one or two books before that. I had Daredevil at this point as I kept buying and finding issues, and they were in, you know, fair to probably fair reading condition. I didn't buy mint or anything like that. My Daredevil run went back to issue, I think, 5 or 6. I had Spider-Man. I did eventually get Spider-Man 8, and then from there up into the high teens, and then from there on, and then a complete run from like high teens on. Daredevil, I said a complete run. Fantastic Four. Thor, I went back to, I think my earliest issue was like 109, Journey into Mystery, and I probably had a couple, and then somewhere around 115 with the Destroyer I had from that. So I was just, and I look back, I'm buying these for 25 and 50 cents, but which is why the other issue, the next issues that I gave you are going back to the Silver Age.
Right.
Because while I'm reading all the Bronze, and now we'll get to that, while the Bronze Stage is happening with these great Bronze Age books, I'm reading the Silver Age for books that I didn't read at the time. So it's just, it's a strange, change for me. I'm going from, okay, or occasionally reading a book to now I'm reading everything that's coming out, and I'm collecting and reading these big runs. And, and just completely, loving every bit of it. I mean, it was formative.
Well, I had a similar experience I mentioned before, where similar in some ways, but I had gotten around 1986, towards the end of 86, a friend of my father's had been buying comics when he was in college, and he gave me about 1,000 issues that came out between 73 and 76. So they were mostly DC, but some Marvels, all this early to mid Bronze Age Marvel stuff that was 10 to 15 years old when I was getting it. And so I really got into the older Bronze Age stuff and collecting the old stuff. I wanted to get the oldest stuff. I'm just old enough to have some experience with the experience you're talking about with the catalogs.
Yeah, okay.
Because they have the ads in the back of the comics, and it was at the time still where I would send them what I wanted and my money, and then I'd have to include a list of alternate books, because if they sold those out, and I did that once, and I got some alternate books because they didn't have what I wanted. I don't even remember what I ordered, but I remember what I got, and I was just trying to the oldest things I could afford. Yeah. And I remember what I ended up with was a Daredevil number 8 and an X-Men number 12.
It's Daredevil 8. Was that the Submariner, or was that
Stiltman?
Stiltman. And 12 was the Stranger, I believe. X-Men 12.
No, X-Men 11 is a Stranger. 12 was the first Juggernaut, but he doesn't actually appear in it. You only see him as he's smashing things. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, X-Men, I started buying X-Men back to I actually had a really terrible copy of X-Men 2 that the cover is falling off. But and by the way, X-Men, horrible book. After the Sentinels in issue 16, 17, those, when it gets into from 20 until Neil Adams picks it up, it's a terrible, terrible book.
It's basically Kirby leaves and the book goes in the dumper immediately.
And they had some bad artists, and but the interesting and I mean the interesting thing is I'm buying books. That was the whole through the 70s, as I'm buying books, I'm buying back issues, is the whole newsstand chase, where I'm going to 3 2, 3, 4 stores every Wednesday or Thursday. I think they changed it at one point to buy the books, because I'd go to 7-Eleven, I'd go to a drugstore because they wouldn't all have them. And, just thinking about it, by the end of the 70s, there were comic book stores enough for me to go, there were comic book stores in my area. So by the end of the 70s, I could just go to a comic book store.
Yeah.
But I do remember knowing the schedule for Marvel. Like, it's the 4th Tuesday. Oh, that's Fantastic Four and Captain America, say, or something like that. So I knew what was supposed to come out. And when it didn't come out, I go, oh, what does this mean? It's
Right.
late, But, and it was just, it was, you tell that to people now, and it was a cool thing. It was just a lot of fun.
So I see on the list you sent me that you have, now I'm assuming the Captain America 110 to 113 with the Steranko issues. Those are ones that you got as back issues.
Yeah. So those are just the 3 earlier issues are just highlights. I mean, I remember Mike talking about that, and that was one of the early Captain Americas I tried to get right away, and because it's one of the great books of the Silver Age. It's just that was, as I'm getting these Silver Age books, a book like that, it's phenomenal. It's 3 issues, it's 4 issues, but there's the Kirby fill-in because, Strangle says he wasn't late. There was other issues with that, but they're just amazing. They have those 2-page splashes in them. Those are, they were books. Those 3 books are books that I would constantly dig out and look at over and over again, because they're just phenomenal books. They're a high point for the Silver Age. And those are some of the I think I put 3 Silver Age titles in there because those were books that just really meant something to me as far as my reading when I started buying the back issues. And those, Captain America I liked. It wasn't one of my top books. I always enjoyed it. There was in the 150s soon after I started reading, there was a whole plot with the Commie Smasher Captain America comes back, and the final battle was in Miami, which is very cool living in Miami when your town shows up in a book, with some nice Sal Buscema art. But those 3 issues are just, you can't say enough about it. And they're still reprinting them. They're still talking about them. So that's why those are there, because it's like, you want a highlight of the Silver Age. I know one of our fellows on the forum doesn't think Steranko deserves, to be, up there. But
he's
I
wrong.
don't know how
He's
I
wrong.
don't know how you.
He's also a fan of Rob Liefeld, so
Yeah, it's true.
That's yeah.
And that because he didn't do enough books, which he did quite a few, because he did that whole Shield run in Strange Tales, and then he did. And the truth is, you think about it, Romita didn't do all that many Spider-Man. He did like 40 issues of Spider-Man, which is a nice run. But then he stopped doing books. He did a few, Daredevils. He did a few Captain Americas. And he did Spider-Man. A lot of those were helped by Jim Mooney. And not that Romita isn't what it shouldn't be the Spider-Man artist for a lot of people, but Gil Kane took over. Romita came back for a few issues, but his body of work isn't that great. It's because he became the art director. So all of Marvel's art became Romita's art, and he did a lot of great covers. But it's just you can't go by he didn't do enough work. It's just but those Captain Americas are just amazing.
Yeah, I totally agree. Why don't we pause here? I'm running
Okay.
like it's about to run out of time, and I don't want it to just shut off. So what I'm
Okay.
going to do is I'll stop the call. It's going to take this about 8 to 10 minutes to process the recording. So
Okay.
it's about 10 minutes. I'll send you a new link, and we'll start the second half.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, why don't we start? Let's talk about the other couple of Silver Age books on your list.
Okay.
I'm curious how they affected you. Starting with it looks like Doctor Strange 172.
Yeah. Okay, that's one, like a Doctor Strange 172 is just, it's the first Gene Colan Doctor Strange. I think Dan Atkins did the previous 2 issues, and then Gene Colan took over, and it lasted like 11 issues till like I think 183. But those were remarkable, and mainly because of Gene Colan. I mean, I've talked to people who say the stories were terrible. They weren't terrible, but as far as what comics can do, Gene Colan reinvented the comic page. He blew out panels. He had whole pages where there were no panels, where it was the, you know, I just found, again, highlight of the Silver Age. I just, I think Gene Colan, you say that and people say, yeah, he's really good. He was remarkable. I loved his Daredevil, especially the ones that Sid Shore inked. I actually like those more than the, Tom Palmer Daredevil. But on that, the combination of Gene Colan and Tom Palmer it was, going to other worlds. Now, those were, I hadn't really read yet. People will go, oh, you should have read I don't think I had read the Ditko ones yet. So I might have read a few Strange Tales, but those issues are just, again, those were issues that I would go back to my comic boxes and dig through them and look at them over and over again. They just blew me away. It's like what comics resonated with you. And as a matter of fact, years later in the 90s, I was at a convention. Gene Colan was there with his wife selling pages of those books. Fool that I am, I only bought one page, but it was the splash page to 172, his first Doctor Strange with Dormammu, or as they say in the movie, Dormammu, but I still think it's Dormammu. Holding Dr.
Dormammu, so
yeah, it's one of those things. Is it the movie really pronounced everything different than I had ever pronounced it? The wand of Watum and all that. But I owned that page, buying it for it was less than $50 from Gene Colan, which was, I should have just bought every Doctor Strange page he had, but I didn't. I didn't have, it's when I want to spend, but those books are just phenomenal. You just, the art is just, he's just breaking down. He gets to a point where there's no panel. There's no 4 or 6 or 9 panel layout. He's just taking everything and it just so fit the book, because it's not, Doctor Strange does not take place in the real world. It's a mystical book. And he brought that further. I mean, when he started doing Dracula, there's a lot of weird angled panels and things like that. But I just love those books. I just think they're just amazing.
Yeah, Gene Colan, that's one of the hallmarks for me when I'm reading a book. Of course, his art is almost, you can almost always tell immediately that he was the penciler.
Yeah.
But the page layout is also very different. And that's the hallmark that I always see with him, particularly if there's action sequences where there won't be any panel, and the movement of the characters and the lines make your eye go in the right order, but it creates this feeling of like a propulsive movement through time where you don't have the panels, the borders in between, the gutters, and so everything just flows right into the next bit. I remember he did a 3-issue run on Avengers, or a couple issues, like 65, and he has, I think it's 65, that has this 2-page splash sequence where it's a 2-page spread, but it's a bunch of little panels overlapping that sort of go
Yeah.
like this in between, and there's all this empty space around it. I remember reading an interview where he turned those pages in, and Stanley was like, "Don't ever do that again." But he was doing this stuff with the
Yeah.
movement and the flow.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
Go
no,
ahead.
he was really, influenced. He was a photographer, so a lot of that stuff looks like black and white photography. He's highly realistic if you look at the faces and all that, and movies. But also, and he could do super. I mean, his run on Captain America was really good. He could do superheroes straight. He could do big, brawny superheroes. Daredevil, which he did for um, most of he took over in like an issue right after Ramita, which was maybe issue 18 or something, somewhere around there, and went all the way through, 100 or so. I don't remember the exact way, but and they were great. I loved his Daredevil, but when he did that kind of thing, that's why, and he did. Everybody remembers from Iron Man when he was using a pseudonym at first, Adam Austin, and Submariner. But those Doctor Stranges, I think he just let it rip.
Yeah, there's
And
almost no point in him using a pseudonym. You can tell it's his art immediately. His style is so
yes,
distinctive. I don't know why they even bothered trying.
they were under contract. He was under contract to DC. A lot of those guys, all those guys, it turns out, and you knew who they were. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know why they did, but I guess legally he could say, no, I don't know who Adam Austin is.
In the late 80s and early 90s, he worked for Archie. He did a lot of stuff on Life with Archie, and there's an issue in a haunted house there's definitely like a Tomb of Dracula. They didn't let him do the cover of all the things to have him do the cover for the haunted house, but there's a sequence in one of those issues that's like an action sequence, and he does the thing where it's a full page with no gutters, and it just flows around, and it's so Gene Colan, and it's so weird to see that action sequence in an Archie comic where Archie's like fighting a vampire or something. So I'm curious about your next book from the Silver Age that you got there, Fantastic Four Annual number 6.
Okay, so that's because the Silver Age of Marvel's Kirby, and let's face it, Kirby helped pretty much create it, or but I won't get into who created who. I really think Kirby did a lot of the creation. I think Stan's voice was very important in the Silver Age. I think his voice made Spider-Man or the Fantastic Four who they were. I think Stan using the Shakespearean dialect in Thor really made that book, so I'm not going to get into, he was just the editor and not the writer or things like that. But and also look at Silver Surfer. John Buscema, who hadn't been at Marvel that long, wasn't all of a sudden going to start writing all these long books. Stanley was writing, but Fantastic Four was the best Kirby book by far. And truthfully, he did take over. I mean, there's a point, you'd have to look somewhere, maybe in the 40s or somewhere, it just started saying created by. Nobody, I think he wanted story credit, and Stan would give him, he said, we'll just say by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And I think there was a point where, and Stan was, because of how busy he was, just said, okay, Jack, do books. And definitely by the time the Inhumans come up, I think it's all Jack turning in pages, say, this is the story, Stan, and write it. And Stan did great jobs writing. And if you look at that run from the Battle of the Baxter Building, where they take on Doctor Doom, through just, and there's stuff after that, through the Doctor Doom Silver Surfer saga, which ended in 60. Those 20 books. I don't know if there's a more creative. You have the Inhumans, Galactus and the Silver Surfer, the Black Panther, and then this epic story of Dr. Doom taking the Silver Surfer's power. And then soon after that, I mean, in the 60s, and he created the Kree, and then him who becomes Warlock. I mean, it's just amazing. So, and the reason I picked this issue, Annual 6, you know, I could have picked one of those from the 40s, especially, you know, 50, is I really think if you read Annual 6, which is the Annihilus, or you might pronounce them a different way, the origin of Annihilus, where they go to the negative zone. This is pretty much Kirby turning in a complete book. I don't think Stan knew it, because it is Kirby. It is all Kirby, and the combination of Kirby and Sinote is, you know, the best combination in comic history. I mean, the way he inked Kirby is just gorgeous, and though that book has the best Kirby art of any Fantastic Four he did. I want to show you this. This is why I don't collect comics anymore. I collect these very expensive original art books that reproduce the original art in full size. That's, you know, so I don't collect comics. I still read comics, I just don't collect them. So this one, of all things, you know, one of my favorite Kirby things, has the original art to Annual 6. Lucky me. I have the Silver Surfer edition. I didn't pull it up. It so happens to have the art to issue 6, my favorite Silver Surfer. So this one, I just want to show you one page. This page, is this coming through?
Yeah.
This is just a page where these creatures called the Borers are just digging through something. I mean, it's one of these Kirby, I'm going to throw in a full page panel of these strange creatures. It's, you know, and there's you know, page after page and splash page, you know, Kirby stuff. The artwork is just Kirby firing on all filters. He's just creating one of his stories where he just, you know, I'll put it back there. He's just this story of them going to the negative zone and fighting Annihilus, and it's just fantastic. The artwork, it's Kirby artwork at its best. So I could have picked almost any book, any you know, Fantastic Four from you know, from the mid-30s on, and those are, but that one is just, it's just amazing. It's if you're a fan of Kirby, he did not do a better issue.
Well, you can never go wrong with Kirby. You know, and it's, you know, that issue is I see it a lot these days because it's gone way up in value. You know, I think it's the first appearance of Franklin Richards as well as Annihilus.
It might be. I think you might be right.
And so it's just like, you know, speculators are all over that book. That book's increased in value, but you know, the problem with that type of comic discussion is no one's ever actually talking about the story. And you know, it's always a what if Kirby had stayed in Marvel, because and what he would have done. But yeah, you can't argue with can never argue with a Kirby story.
Yeah. Oh, and of course I left off This Man, This Monster issue 51, which followed the Galactus Silver Surfer story, which might be one of the single best issues of any comic ever written. So, you know, they talk about and over in Thor, meanwhile, he's creating the Rigelians, Ego, the Grand Evolutionary. This is all happening at the same time. It's, you look at what's going on at that period, it's just remarkable. So that's why I picked that issue, though, just because the artwork is, you know, and probably because I have this book and it refreshed how great, you know, I don't know if you remember, it also has one of his collages in the beginning when they go through the negative zone. He did one of these photo collages and he drew, you know, the characters. actually they included the original photo collage here. Here we go.
I bet this reproduces a lot better in that format than printed.
Oh yeah, yeah. Let's see if I can get it. There you go. See, there's the original drawings of the characters, and then that's the photo. Yeah, they do. There's the photo collages. It's 2 pages of photo collages. Is that coming through?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so much crisper. I mean, I love the idea
yeah.
of the photo collages, but I never really like them actually in the comic because the printing is so bad that it just makes it all muddied.
One of the things reading these books, reading the issues in these books and seeing the art, you just kind of, as much as I love the art reading it, seeing them full size as the original art, we lost a lot on the printing in the old newsprint. Today, I think we lose a lot because they overcolor and you lose so much of the artists. I'd rather, there's a lot of books I'd rather just have in black and white than the way they're coloring them, because they so overcolor them you can't even see the line anymore.
Yeah, I agree. So let's move to your next book, book 8. I think we're back in the Bronze Age now.
Yeah. So which was I can't remember what order I put them in.
I think you had switched out a couple at the last minute. I think this next one is it Adventures into
yes, Adventures into Fear 19.
Yeah.
Which I just I picked a nice color for you to put a cover for you to put up. Basically, that's Man-Thing. Man-Thing started in Savage Tales, which was a whole nother thing of the Bronze Age, all those black and white books, which was another thing going on. I mean, if I'm reading comics and all of a sudden these black and white, and I imagine if I had been collecting since the early 60s, it would have felt different, but it's just like, oh, more stuff coming out. And looking back, you go, this is pretty historical that all of a sudden they broke the code. Now and not only that, they're doing Savage Sword of Conan, they're doing Savage Tales. They started, doing the black and white book. So Man-Thing started in Savage Tales 1, which I did have a copy of. And it was basically the Swamp Thing, but the difference was Ted Sallis, he was, everybody know he became this sort of thing. He wasn't a thinking thing. It was just, but Man-Thing was very, what you said, it was indicative of the Bronze Age of books that weren't superhero books. Man-Thing let, the cool thing about Man-Thing was it was the story around him. He was just a MacGuffin at times, or a Deus Ex Machina to solve the story. I picked 19 because I like the cover. It's also the first Howard the Duck, where they're in another dimension. The duck appears in one panel that later became Howard the Duck. But I love Man-Thing. I love Val Myrick's work. And then Mike Plug took over, who I love. So those are 2 really good Bronze Age, stalwart artists. And it's just indicative of what I loved about the Bronze Age. It wasn't just the Marvel superheroes, but you had things like Man-Thing, and Plug also did Werewolf by Night, and you had Frankenstein. Val Myrick did The Living Mummy. You had these, and then there's Master of Kung Fu, which I could have picked also, which was a non-superhero book that was just phenomenal for like 100 issues. It just never, I think it waned at the very end after Gene Day left, but you went through, it started with Jim Starlin. We went through all those Paul Gulacy's, and then Mike Zeck, and then Gene Day, and it was a great book. And it was not superhero. It was a book you could just read absent the rest of Marvel. But I picked that as just sort of, that's the Bronze Age. All these great, I had Avengers, with the Kree War, but you had these wonderful books that were not the superhero world, and not, it was a connected universe, but they weren't doing crossovers at the time. A crossover back then was one book appeared, Fantastic Four appeared in Spider-Man. That's your crossover. And occasionally it was Avengers and Defenders. Occasionally you'd have to read the story through 2 books. That was the crossovers.
Yeah, that's actually this what I love about the Bronze Age. We talked a little bit about how, in the 90s on the big 2 sort of got rid of their genre books. But the great thing about the Bronze Age is all the books that are not superhero books. And there's some great superhero stuff in the Bronze Age. I mean, Avengers is great for the whole decade, and you have the new X-Men and stuff at the end. But for me, I think the superhero stuff in the 70s is not as vital as it was in the 60s. But everything else is tremendous. The huge explosion when they lifted the code restrictions that allowed all the horror books, and all that stuff. And
the Dracula, Gene Colan again doing just probably some of the best work. I still love those Doctor Strange, but his stuff in Tomb of Dracula was just, you could tell. I don't think he liked doing superheroes. And I think Tomb of Dracula gave him a chance to do something he really loved, because he did every issue. He did 75 issues.
Yeah, but there's the 70s, just like many of my favorite books. Bronze Age is my favorite era, even though it's before I was collecting, because of all of the sort of offbeat titles that could get an audience at that time. I love Warlord, Unknown Soldiers, one of my favorites, The Losers, Tomb of Dracula, Ghost Rider, Morbius, like all of these characters. Deathlock, I'm a big fan of.
Oh, I love Deathlock.
All these characters that are
also one of my favorite, especially when P.K. Greg Russell took over, was Killraven, War of the Worlds. That was one where you saw him. If you look at those, if you ever have a chance, you look at his development from his early stuff, which was sort of lame Marvel-looking, Marvel house style, his early Killraven, and he just each issue he improved until the end of his run. He looks like P. Craig Russell. He just changed it's just the growth of it's. You saw the growth of an artist into a phenomenal talent. And even Kirby, what was he do after the Fourth World? He did Commandy and The Demon, which are not superhero books.
And his run on Losers is excellent.
Yes, really is. Yeah, those I love those.
But it's funny because everything you cited about why you liked Man-Thing are reasons I don't like Man-Thing. Everyone knows that I don't like swamp monsters, but Man-Thing, it's like the fact that he is basically a MacGuffin. He's a prop in his own comic. I just don't like it. I don't like mindless characters. He's a force of nature, literally, that just sort of stumbles through and things, as a catalyst or whatever. And I don't like that. And for me, I know this is blasphemy for a lot of people that are slightly older than I am. I just don't get Steve Gerber. I feel like you had to be there.
It might be. It might well be. I mean, at the time they were so different, so many interesting. He'd just do these stories that were just out of nowhere. The Fool Killer, which I thought was just a parody of the Vigilante. There was one he did with John Buscema, which was just all big panels of the TikTok, life death of the life and death of some. They were just bizarre and wonderful at the time. Now, it could be you go back 10 or 20 years later and read them and they don't work. I haven't reread those. I have not reread the Man-Things, and I'm not sure if a lot of the Bronze Age stuff I reread. I got the Conan omnibus and I loved it. All the first 25 issues. And I know when I read some of the Silver Age stuff, I still enjoy it. But Gerber might not have aged well.
Well, it's possible that I might be wrong. I mean, because I remember reading a lot of his stuff in the late 80s and early 90s when I was much younger, and it just reading his Defenders and reading, Howard the Duck and Omega, and
Yeah.
just scratching my head and just being like,
I didn't think his Defenders were that good, and I didn't think Omega was that good. I loved his Howard the Duck, but that was sort of a very of the time character.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the other next Bronze Age book you have in your list, I think we're at book number 9, and that's superhero stuff, sort of, mostly. Captain Marvel, number 25.
Again, the Bronze Age. So you had Jim Starlin. Now, even though Kirby and the Fantastic Four and they did cosmic stuff with things, this was, just a highlight of the Bronze. I mean, it's Thanos. He created Thanos. A character has stayed relevant, I think. So I was trying to think of a book that I just loved during the Bronze Age that was, special. Starlin did this cosmic thing, and I mean, the Infinity Gauntlet was good, but when he did this run of Captain Marvel and then took the same kind of thread into Warlock, it was like every issue you go, that was phenomenal. And so he turned Captain Marvel and he really did in a way that hadn't been addressed. The full-on cosmic, superhero with these. So which I have the Jim Starlin with so when he would do things like this with Kronos caught between worlds, it was just, to my young self, this was mind-blowing, literally. So I think I just I could have gone with Master of Kung Fu. I just was trying to pick a Bronze Age book that you'd read and go, when's the next one coming out? This is just amazing what this guy's doing.
Yeah, so I was an Avengers fan. Of course, I have that story. I've read that story, and you're right. It's excellent. It's very foundational for a lot of stuff that's happened in Marvel since then. And to me personally, it's the best of Starlin's work. I'm not a big fan of Starlin because I feel like he had this one thing that went over well, and he was like, well, people like that, let me tell that story again for the next 45 years.
Yeah.
So I'm not a huge fan of like his stuff with Warlock. Some of it's really interesting. Some of it starts to get a little navel gazy, which is basically everything Starlin's done since for me. Yeah. But that initial run on Captain Marvel, when it was actually new, like when that was a new ideas that he was doing there, it's really good. I think it's his best work, and maybe his best art as well, because I don't really love his later artwork either.
Yeah, I mean, Warlock though, that was a time, because as I said, I'm an art guy. When he did Warlock, he really, I think, the artwork up at his art on Warlock is phenomenal. Especially there were a few issues he inked himself. He had Al Milgrom with him. It was just, that was, again, I remember reading them going, when is this? He did some fun things in Warlock with Pip the Troll and space sharks and things like that. And the art was just, I think there was always delays in Warlock because it was just, he was doing too much. It was one of those things where we've talked about where the old guys are going, you can't do that. You can't put that much art into a page, because if we did that, we couldn't support our family, So,
yeah,
I think his art in Warlock is just, I agree with you. I think he probably realized you can't do that. You can't put that much art in every page. So I think his later art, I enjoyed it. I do love his style. I think he just pulled back so that he could actually draw a full comic.
Yeah. So I think we're at your last book, and now we're jumping ahead a bit. It's Fantastic Four Annual number 1998.
Yes, the death of Marvel superheroes for me. Okay, so I'm reading, and by the 80s, I started reading a lot more DC because that was after the Dark Knight, and Byrne came over and reinvented Superman. And, you know, I think by the 80s, I'm reading a lot, both equally, and there's all these other First Comics, Dark Horse, you know, Comico, there's Rocketeer, there's all these other things. I'm not as much of a Marvel zombie. And by the 90s, I'm dropping a lot of Marvel books. I'm still reading Spider-Man. I think sporadically X-Men. X-Men became almost unreadable at times. I know Jim Lee came over, but and what this issue is, it was written by Carl Kessel and drawn by Stuart Immonen, and it takes place, the Thing goes to an alternative universe in which all the Silver Age Marvel characters are themselves. They haven't aged forward. So there's one scene where they're at a card table, and I can't remember who. I think they say, "Oh, Bruce Banner just died." You know, they're old, and this is one of the things. And by the next decade or so, I gave up all Marvel and DC. I tried to stay with them, you know, through all the rehashes. I think the what happened, the events killed it for me, where you're reading a storyline and they interrupt it for some event you don't care about, a lot of that. But what this did, the reason this resonated with me, I still have a copy of it, is that it was like, it kind of brought into focus. I go, wait, those were my guys. It's just okay. Again, I got older. The comics they were writing were not my guys. It's not my Spider-Man. It's like my Ben and Reed fought in World War II. Nick Fury fought in World War II. Spider-Man hung out in the village in the 60s. So these older, you know, gray-haired characters, it's like, oh, those are my guys. And the guys now, they didn't feel as real to me anymore. It's kind of hard when you have, at that point, okay, this is 1998, so you have almost 40 years of history that you somehow, because it's not, you know, Superman where it's all imaginary stories and doesn't matter what happened, you know, from the 60s. It's like all those stories still happen. Marvel's not saying what happened, you know, that you know, Doc Ock and Mysterio and the Galactus saga didn't happen. So it kind of just, the reason this book, it's like, it brought into focus to me. I go, well, it just doesn't work anymore. That all this stuff, that those guys are who they are, now they have to invent some war where Reed and Ben fought. It wasn't Vietnam, it was some, you know, and it just kind of started me moving away from Marvel and DC superheroes, which I don't read anymore. I'll occasionally, a book will come up that I'll find interesting. You know, somebody will take on Doctor Strange. I said, oh, I'll read that. Or I read Mark Waid and Chris Samney did Captain America, and I like their work. So, but I just don't read them. And that is the key issue that led me to not read them.
Yeah, I think a lot of us older readers have had some version of this experience. I mean, for me, you know, it was Avengers 500 is where I really started realizing that it wasn't even that the characters, I realized that the books were not aimed at me anymore.
Yeah.
They wanted to cater to a different audience than me. And I still hung on for a few years, but Civil War and Secret Invasion, but Civil War in particular, really put the nail in the coffin, where I was like,
yeah,
no, they, you know, they don't want to, they're not writing for me. But I think Marvel's taken this sliding timeline idea to try, and so they have the same continuity universe. They just move things around. In some ways, I think DC theoretically had a better idea with just rebooting it every 25 years or so. They've completely messed up the execution every single time. But
yeah, absolutely.
you know, like
Yeah.
I remember reading an issue of X-Men in the 90s. It was right around the time, it was right around X-Men 30 when Scott Summers and Jean, back from the dead, finally get married. And there was a comment where someone said something to Scott Summers, and he made a comment that he was only 25 years old. And this is in like 1995.
Yeah.
And I just remember staring at the book going, there's no way this character's 25. He's got to be, for in my head, he's like 34 at that point. He started in X-Men 1 when he's 16, and there's no way that 32 years of stories later he's only 25. And it just pulled me out of it, and I realized like that there's just they got so far away from the original Marvel feel.
I know. I mean, look, Captain America was in ice for about 20 years. Now he's been in ice for 90. I mean, let's see, the 65, that's 60, 70, 80 years. It's just, and also it's like when you live through, I my back, 60s were my back issues, but definitely through the Bronze Age, I'm living through these stories. So you can't tell me they didn't happen that way. And now it's just the readjustment of like, no, I'm as old as these guys now in Fantastic Four Annual 98. It's like, no, I was the same age as Peter Parker at one point. So I'm not, I understand, but it just, I think the main thing, it wasn't that the characters were now used to be older than me, now younger than me. I think it was that the continuity had to hold, and all those stories I've been reading for, that's 40 years of story, happened, but right, they're still, Peter Parker's 20. It's just hard, and I agree. Civil War and Secret Invasion and those, it became obvious that the fiat from Marvel was, we'll do a big crossover event and somebody important will die. I forget the first time they did that, but then they just said every year we'll do that. And it became, that's, you're just, trying to, there's nothing organic about that.
The other thing for me is, and I have the same feeling about DC's movies, is that there's a definite feeling that you get from the comics starting around 2004. So, it's Iraq War, post 9/11, Bush era. You have the very distinct feeling in all of the comics that the people making the comics no longer believe in heroes. And when you have superheroes in a universe where the creators don't believe in heroes, then it's not something I want to be part of anymore. Everyone has to be morally conflicted, grim and gritty. The new Avengers, the whole point of it is in the first storyline, they add Wolverine to the team because they need to have someone who can kill people. That's completely opposite the whole Avengers ethos. And Captain America's fine with it because he realizes he's outdated in that first. He's like, and so I'm like, that's not.
Yeah. They're not our books anymore, which is fine. I mean, fortunately, there's enough for me to read. I don't read I'm not reading the way, probably by the 80s, I'm reading whatever, 40 books a month. Now I'm probably reading, it seems to be about 2 or 3 books a week, but they're Image and Dark Horse and Independence, and they're contained, and they're good. I mean, there's some great creators. It's just, the superheroes just, they're not for me anymore.
Yeah, I only have one title on my pull list, which is Usagi Yojimbo.
Really?
And I think there's a new series, a new run of Aerosmith by Kurt Busiek.
That just started.
So that I'm gonna buy, but that's it. I had been buying all the Archie line, but that all got canceled. So yeah, it's just when they reached the point there for many years where they were super powered costumed characters, but they weren't superheroes. They weren't heroes anymore.
Yeah.
The whole Dark Reign, this whole 2-year period where the villains were the heroes, and
Yeah.
that's when I canceled all of my Marvel titles. And DC,
Yeah.
I was already checked out of DC before that. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah. So I think mine somewhere after Secret Invasion or somewhere along that, I started buying less and less. And as I said, when I was buying less and less, then I'm reading. I don't. Let's say I was reading a Hulk story that I liked, or a Daredevil story I liked, and it's going along. Maybe I forget who. Maybe Bendis was doing it, and all of a sudden, like 3 issues are interrupted because this other storyline has to come in, which just kind of destroyed any kind of flow of the story. And it's like I don't care about that other story. And they'd have they decide every book has to be part of this story.
yeah.
And and then they do things like something would happen in that story that happened in another book. Oh, that was in Avengers. Well, I'm not reading Avengers, and I'm reading Daredevil. So and DC was almost worse with their big crossovers. They'd have characters come up that were in ancillary, they do these big crisis, storylines, and there'd be like a book that was just that nobody bought, but that was the main villain came out of that. It's like, okay, great. You could tell us. But so I mean, Brubaker and Greg Rooker are 2 of my favorite writers now. I like the Mark Miller stuff. Everybody hates him, but I like his stuff. I like the Hellboy stuff. It's I know everybody hates Mark Miller,
Yeah,
but
my wife likes some of the movies that are based on his work, but I told her, I was like, I have one rule: I never read or watch anything by Mark Miller. That's my number 1 rule. But
what did you read of him that you hated?
Civil War.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, but I the only superhero book I read of his, well, Civil War, sure, that wasn't good, but his Superman the animated series was fantastic, actually. When everybody loved Batman the animated series. Well, I'm talking about his own. They have a certain they're kind of there is some violence, but things like Kick Ass and what's the one that was just a Netflix show?
I don't remember. Jupiter or something or other.
Yeah, Jupiter's Children. Those the ones he's creating on his own. I enjoy all of them. His superhero work might have sucked, but his own, he did ones called Super Crooks, which was a lot of fun. The Magic Order. They're really fun books. I mean, there's some heavy ultra violence at times, but they're fun books.
He's just too cynical for me. But
well, Starlight, read Starlight. It's not cynical at all. It's very joyful. It's Flash Gordon is old and retired and has to go back to help the planet. Starlight, really fun. And the Kingsman was fun.
Origins, it's where we come from, it's where we've been. Everyone's got one. Origin story.